All right, today we're diving into one of the most consequential and, controversial figures of the 20th century, Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. He really was, in every sense of the word, the architect of a nation.
So let's get right into it. Lee Kuan Yew is, without a doubt, seen as Singapore's founding father. This is the man who transformed a small, kind of forgotten island port into a global economic powerhouse. But his story, well, it's also one of iron-fisted rule, which raises that huge question we're going to explore. What was the real cost of all that success?
And this slide, it just lays out that contradiction perfectly. It's a total paradox. On one side, you've got the Asian tiger, this incredible success story, right? Built on good ideas like meritocracy and multiracialism. But on the other side, you've got the nanny state. That's the label for his authoritarian style, the restricted freedoms, what a lot of people called an illiberal democracy. This is the puzzle we're going to try and piece together today.
To really get a handle on his legacy, we're going to walk through 4 key moments in his story. First, how a major crisis basically created the man he would become. Then, his very calculated climb to power. After that, the absolute heartbreak of Singapore's separation from Malaysia. And finally, how he built a unique Singapore model out of the ashes.
So let's start at the beginning. Forged by crisis. To really understand the leader Lee Kuan Yew became, you first have to understand the event that completely shattered his world when he was just a young man. In 1942, the unthinkable happened. The British Empire, this supposedly unbeatable force, surrendered Singapore to the Japanese. Now, during that occupation, a young Lee was rounded up in an operation called Suk Ching. It was a brutal purge of anyone suspected of being anti-Japanese, and by his own account, he came this close to being executed. He saved his own life with some quick thinking, asking to go back for his clothes. That simple move meant he avoided being taken away and killed with the rest of his group.
The impact of this time, wow, it's summed up perfectly in his own words. He said, "In 70 days, British colonial society was shattered, and with it all the assumptions of the Englishman's superiority." That experience lit a fire in him, a lifelong conviction. Singaporeans had to be the ones in charge of their own destiny. They could never ever be at the mercy of others again.
And that conviction leads us straight into our next chapter, the path to power. When he returned from studying law at Cambridge, he wasn't just a lawyer, he was a revolutionary with a very clear game plan. He didn't just stumble into politics, he built his power base piece by piece. Back in Singapore, he became a legal hero for the unions, constantly taking on the British authorities. Then, in 1954, he co-founded the People's Action Party, or PAP. And here's the key move. He made an alliance with the party's powerful pro-communist wing to build a real mass movement. It was a deal with the devil, in a way, one that would lead to a massive internal power struggle later on.
And this is just a fantastic example of his political cleverness. Check out this referendum ballot from 1962. He wanted to merge with Malaysia, but instead of a simple yes or no, he designed it with 3 different options for how to merge. There was no direct no option. He basically engineered the vote to get the result you wanted, even making it so that blank votes would count for the most popular choice. Genius, right?
And then came a move that was, well, it was decisive and deeply controversial. In 1963, right before the merger, Operation Cold Store went down. Over 100 opposition leaders and activists were detained, all without a trial. His biggest rival, Lim Chin Siong, was arrested. This one move effectively wiped out the PAP's left wing and cemented Lee's total control at a really critical moment.
Which brings us to our third section, the anguish of separation. The merger he had fought so hard for, the one he'd been so clever about, was supposed to be Singapore's salvation. Instead, it became an absolute nightmare. Those 2 years inside Malaysia were just filled with tension. The PAP was pushing for a multiracial Malaysian Malaysia, which was a direct threat to the federal government's policy of putting ethnic Malays first. This ideological fight, stirred up by ultranationalists, literally exploded into deadly race riots on the streets of Singapore in 1964. Add in a bunch of economic disputes, and the whole union was just becoming impossible.
Then, on August 9, 1965, Singapore was kicked out of the Federation. For Lee, this was more than a political failure, it felt like a personal one. In this now famous emotional press conference, you can just see him breaking as he says, "All my life, I have believed in Malaysian merger." His grand plan was in ruins. And just like that, Singapore was on its own, a tiny, resourceless nation in a pretty hostile neighborhood.
And that crisis, that moment of utter despair, brings us to our final section, the Singapore model. Cast out and alone, Singapore had no choice but to survive. And this is where Lee Kuan Yew, the architect, began his most ambitious project ever.
The government's actions were incredibly fast and pragmatic. They solved a massive housing crisis with an insane public housing program. They made multiracialism a core pillar of the country's identity. They were absolutely ruthless in stamping out corruption, and they laid the foundation for an economic miracle, literally turning swamps into a huge industrial hub that brought in foreign money.
But, and you knew there was a but coming, this incredible progress came at a steep price. The government controlled the press, heavily. The right to gather publicly was limited. Lee became famous for using defamation lawsuits to bankrupt his political opponents. And that Internal Security Act, it allowed the government to detain people without trial, a powerful tool to silence anyone who disagreed.
So how did he justify these tough, authoritarian measures? Well, he had a whole philosophy for it, which became known as Asian values. The basic argument was that for a fragile, young society like Singapore, the good of the community and the need for stability and economic growth had to come before Western ideas of individual freedom. It was a pragmatic argument for sure, but a really controversial one.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative question. What does it actually take to build a nation from nothing? Lee Kuan Yew's legacy doesn't give us a simple answer. It gives us a complicated, uncomfortable, and frankly, a deeply compelling one. It forces us to think about the trade-offs between order and freedom, between progress and dissent, a debate that is just as relevant today in Singapore and all over the world as it was when he first took power.